They broke her legs, silenced her wolf, and left her in the cellar to rot. To the Blackwood pack, Elara Hughes was just a shattered, useless Omega. But when the ruthless Alpha King stepped into their territory, he didn't look at the pristine noblewomen. Through the stench of fear and ash, he caught a single scent, and found his destiny. The heavy oak bucket bit into Elara's scarred palms, the freezing well water sloshing over the brim and soaking into the hem of her frayed linen dress. It was barely dawn. The sky over the Blackwood pack lands still bruised with purple and grey. Yet the manor was already alive with a frantic, suffocating energy. Elara limped toward the kitchen courtyard, dragging her left leg slightly. The dull, persistent ache in her shin was a constant reminder of Derek Mitchell. 2 years ago, Derek, the pack's soon-to-be beta, and a man known for his cruel temper, had cornered her near the boundary lines. When Elara, a lowly Omega, had the audacity to refuse his unwanted advances, he hadn't just rejected her existence, he had made an example of her. He shattered her leg in 3 places and beat her until her inner wolf retreated into a silent, dormant coma. The pack healer barely set the bones, leaving her with a permanent limp and the cruel moniker she bore today, the Broken Omega. An Omega without a wolf is nothing but a drain on the pack's meat. Keep her out of sight, or I'll finish what Derek started. Alpha Gregory's decree regarding Elara. To survive, Elara made herself invisible. She learned to mask her natural scent, a soft, sweet blend of wild honey and rain, by rubbing hearth ash and crushed bitter root into the pulse points on her neck and wrists. It made her smell like stale smoke and dirt, a scent that disgusted the dominant wolves enough to keep them away. Today, however, the air in the manor was entirely different. Elara pushed open the heavy kitchen doors to find the head cook, a harsh woman named Beatrice, frantically organizing trays of roasted pheasant and spiced wine. "Move, you useless cripple!" Beatrice snapped, shoving past Elara and nearly sending the water bucket tumbling. "The royal entourage is less than a league away. If the king's retinue finds a single speck of dirt in the Great Hall, Alpha Gregory will have our hides." Elara lowered her head, letting her matted brown hair fall over her face. King Silas Sterling, the Alpha King of the Unified Territories. Rumors of Silas were terrifying. He was a colossal, battle-hardened warlord who had conquered the northern rogue factions and united the 13 packs under one crown. He was notoriously ruthless, fiercely private, and, most importantly, mateless. He was touring the territories under the guise of border inspections. But everyone knew the truth. The Alpha King was looking for his queen. "Elara!" Alpha Gregory's booming voice echoed from the archway. The massive, greying man strode into the kitchens, his face flushed with stress. He sneered as he looked at her ash-stained face and ragged clothes. "I want you in the root cellar. You do not come out. You do not make a sound. If King Silas catches even a glimpse of a broken, wolfless wretch in my pack, it will shame us all. Do you understand?" "Yes, Alpha," Elara whispered, her voice barely a rasp. She retreated to the darkest corner of the manor, descending the damp stone steps into the root cellar. It smelled of rotting potatoes and damp earth. She huddled in the corner, pulling her knees to her chest. Overhead, the heavy thud of boots and the sharp cries of commands signaled the preparations reaching a fever pitch. Through a small, barred grate near the ceiling of the cellar, Elara could see the boots of the pack members lining up in the courtyard. The noble she-wolves, daughters of Betas and Alphas from neighboring packs, had gathered, drenched in expensive perfumes, wearing silks and velvets that defied the harsh medieval winter. Leading them was Lady Genevieve Sinclair, a stunning, haughty she-wolf who had practically declared herself the future queen. Then, the ground began to tremble. It wasn't a physical earthquake, but the sheer, oppressive weight of a supreme predator entering the territory. Elara gasped, her hands flying to her chest. For the first time in 2 years, a spark flickered deep within her soul. Her wolf, long thought dead, stirred. Outside, the Blackwood pack dropped to their knees as one. King Silas Sterling rode through the iron gates on a massive black warhorse, accompanied by his beta, Gideon Cross, and a dozen royal guards. Silas was a terrifying sight. He stood over 6.5 feet tall, clad in dark leather armor and a thick fur mantle. His jaw was lined with dark stubble, his cheek bearing a pale, jagged scar from a long-forgotten war. And his eyes, a piercing, unnatural shade of amber, swept over the kneeling pack with absolute indifference. His wolf was agitated. For months, Silas had travelled from pack to pack, enduring the simpering smiles of high-born she-wolves who reeked of desperate ambition and suffocating floral perfumes. His beast wanted a mate, an equal, a soul tied to his by the moon goddess herself. Instead, he was met with politics. "Welcome, Your Majesty," Alpha Gregory grovelled, remaining bowed. "The Blackwood pack is honoured by your presence. We have prepared our finest feast and gathered the most eligible daughters of the realm." "Rise, Gregory," Silas rumbled. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the chests of everyone present. Silas dismounted, his boots crunching against the frost-covered gravel. He walked past the line of hopeful women. Lady Genevieve Sinclair arched her back, deliberately letting her heavy fur cloak slip off one shoulder to reveal her gown. She pushed her scent forward, roses and musk. Silas paused, his nose twitching. Genevieve smiled triumphantly. "You reek of desperation and sour wine," Silas stated bluntly, his amber eyes narrowing with disgust. Genevieve paled, shrinking back as a murmur of shock rippled through the pack. Gideon Cross let out a low chuckle behind his king, shaking his head. "Let us get the inspection over with," Silas said, marching toward the manor doors. "I have no patience for pageantry today." As Silas stepped into the grand hall, the air was thick with roasted meats and heavy spices, but underneath it all, his highly trained senses caught something else. He froze in the center of the hall. His inner wolf, usually a disciplined, terrifying beast of war, suddenly slammed against the forefront of his mind. Mate. Silas inhaled sharply. Beneath the overwhelming odors of the feast, beneath the sweat of the terrified Blackwood wolves, there was a faint, nearly imperceptible trace of wild honey, fresh rain, and distress. But it was buried under the harsh, acrid smell of hearth ash. "Sire?" Gideon asked, noticing the sudden rigidity in his king's shoulders. Silas didn't answer. His amber eyes began to glow, shifting into the dominant gold of his wolf. He ignored Alpha Gregory, who was stammering about the banquet, and began to walk. He wasn't walking like a king inspecting a hall. He was stalking. He followed the faint thread of the scent, moving past the dining tables, ignoring the shocked gasps of the nobles, and pushing straight through the heavy doors into the kitchens. "Your Majesty, please! There is nothing back there but servants!" Gregory panicked, rushing after him. Silas ignored him, his boots thundering against the stone floor. The scent grew stronger, leading him toward a dark, narrow hallway. It led to a heavy wooden door, bolted from the outside. The root cellar. "Mine," his wolf snarled. "She is trapped." Silas reached out, his massive, gloved hand gripping the iron bolt. With a violent jerk, he snapped the lock completely off the wood, the metal screeching in protest. He kicked the door open. Down in the dark, Elara screamed. The sudden crash of the door terrified her. She scrambled backward, her bad leg giving out as she pressed her spine against the freezing, damp stone wall. She threw her arms over her head, expecting Derek, expecting a beating, expecting death. Heavy, slow footsteps descended the stairs. Elara peeked through her trembling fingers. Standing at the bottom of the steps, entirely eclipsing the dim light from the hallway above, was the Alpha King. The air around him crackled with terrifying power. Silas stared at the tiny, trembling figure in the dirt. She was covered in soot, her clothes were literal rags, and she smelled of fear and stale ash. But as he looked at her, the ash couldn't hide the bond. The invisible tether between their souls snapped into place with the force of a lightning strike. Behind Silas, Alpha Gregory, Derek Mitchell, and a crowd of nobles appeared at the top of the stairs, peering down into the gloom. "Your Majesty," Gregory gasped, horrified. "I apologize profusely. That is Elara. She is a broken Omega. Her wolf is dead. She is a cripple. Derek, get down there and drag that filthy wretch out of the king's sight." Derek Mitchell, eager to impress, snarled and took a step down the stairs. "Get up, you stupid bitch!" A roar so deafening, so filled with primal, earth-shattering fury ripped from Silas's chest that the stone walls actually vibrated. Derek froze, all the color draining from his face as the king spun around. Silas's eyes weren't human anymore. They were the blazing, molten gold of a lethal predator protecting its own. "Take one more step toward my queen," Silas growled, his voice a dark, lethal promise that echoed through the stunned silence of the manor, "and I will tear your head from your shoulders." Elara lowered her hands, her breath catching in her throat. Her dead wolf, buried beneath years of trauma and pain, let out a soft, echoing howl in her mind. Silas turned back to Elara. The terrifying, murderous aura vanished instantly. He dropped to one knee in the dirt of the cellar, uncaring of his royal leathers. He reached out with a hand that had conquered nations, moving with agonizing slowness so as not to frighten her, and gently brushed a streak of dirty ash from Elara's trembling cheek. "I have found you," the king whispered, the raw emotion in his voice breaking through his stoic facade. "No one will ever hurt you again." The silence in the root cellar was absolute, broken only by Elara's ragged breathing. King Silas Sterling, the most feared warlord in the 13 territories, remained on one knee in the damp dirt. He didn't care that the hem of his royal mantle was soaking up the muck, nor did he care about the gasps of horror echoing from the nobles at the top of the stairs. His entire universe had narrowed down to the fragile, ash-covered woman trembling before him. "May I?" Silas asked. His voice, usually a weapon that commanded armies, was shockingly gentle. Elara nodded, a tiny jerky movement. Silas reached down, his massive arms sliding beneath her knees and behind her back. As he lifted her, Elara gasped in pain, her badly healed leg protesting the movement. A low, dangerous rumble vibrated in Silas's chest, but he immediately adjusted his grip, pulling her flush against his chest to distribute her weight. He unclasped his heavy, fur-lined winter mantle and draped it over her shivering frame, cocooning her in his warmth and the overpowering, intoxicating scent of pine, winter frost, and dominant alpha. For Elara, it was a sensory overload. Her inner wolf, dormant for 2 agonizing years, was now frantically scratching at the surface of her mind, whining with a mixture of desperate longing and relief. Mate. Safe. Alpha. Silas carried her up the stone steps. The crowd of nobles, pack leaders, and hopeful she-wolves parted like the Red Sea, their faces pale masks of shock. Alpha Gregory stood at the forefront, sweating profusely. "Your Majesty," Gregory stammered, wringing his hands, "I must protest. There has been a mistake. The Moon Goddess would never pair the Alpha King with a flawed, broken thing. Her father, Thomas Hughes, was a known traitor to the crown. We were only keeping her under discipline for her own." "Silence." The word was spoken at a normal volume, but Silas infused it with raw alpha command. The sheer force of it forced Gregory to his knees. The other wolves in the hall immediately dropped their eyes to the floor, baring their necks in absolute submission. Silas stood in the center of the grand hall, Elara cradled against his chest. His amber eyes swept over the lavish feast, the expensive tapestries, and then locked onto Derek Mitchell, who was trying to inconspicuously edge his way toward the heavy oak doors. "Beta Gideon," Silas called out. Gideon Cross stepped forward from the ranks of the royal guard, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his broadsword. "Yes, sire." "Alpha Gregory claims this woman's father, Thomas Hughes, was a traitor. What do the royal tax ledgers say about the Hughes estate?" Silas asked, never taking his eyes off Derek. Gideon pulled a small, leather-bound journal from his tunic, flipping a few pages. Thomas Hughes was the rightful owner of the western logging camps, the most lucrative territory in the Blackwood lands. He was executed for treason by Alpha Gregory 3 years ago. His lands and wealth were subsequently absorbed into Gregory's personal estate. Gideon paused, looking up with a cold smile. However, the royal inspectors found no evidence of treason. It appears it was a convenient execution for a land grab. A collective gasp rippled through the visiting nobles. Lady Genevieve Sinclair, who had been sneering at Elara just moments before, suddenly looked terrified as the political reality of the situation crashed down upon her. "Treason," Silas murmured, the word tasting like venom on his tongue. "You murdered her father to steal his wealth, and then you broke his daughter to keep her silent." "No, sire, I swear upon the moon," Gregory cried, crawling forward on his hands and knees. But Silas wasn't looking at Gregory anymore. He was looking at Derek. Silas had caught the scent of Elara's terror when Derek had spoken in the cellar. The king's nostrils flared. "You," Silas growled, nodding toward Derek. "You are the one who shattered her leg." Derek froze, his back pressed against the heavy oak doors. "She was disrespectful. She is an Omega. It was my right as a superior rank to discipline her." "She is your queen," Silas roared, his voice shattering the nearest stained glass window. The shards rained down upon the feasting tables, and you laid your hands upon a vessel of the crown. Before Derek could even attempt to shift into his wolf form to defend himself, Silas moved. He didn't set Elara down. Holding her securely with one arm, Silas snatched a heavy, silver-hilted hunting dagger from the belt of a nearby guard. With a flick of his wrist, he hurled the blade across the hall. The silver dagger sank deep into Derek's right shoulder, pinning him violently against the oak door. Derek screamed, the burning agony of the silver causing his knees to buckle, but the blade held him upright. "You will live just long enough to face the royal tribunal," Silas stated coldly, turning his back on the screaming wolf. He looked down at Gregory. "Gideon, strip Gregory of his alpha title, arrest him and his inner circle, seize the Blackwood Manor, and freeze all their assets. The logging camps are immediately returned to the Hughes name." "At once, sire," Gideon replied, gesturing for the royal guards to move in. Iron chains rattled as the guards descended upon the corrupt pack leaders. Genevieve Sinclair, unable to process the destruction of her ambitions, stepped forward, her face twisted in ugly jealousy. "You cannot be serious, Your Majesty. You are tearing down a noble house for a crippled maid who smells of garbage. She will never be able to bear you strong heirs. The unified territories will laugh at you." Silas stopped at the threshold of the manor. He looked down at Elara, who had buried her ash-stained face into the soft fur of his cloak, overwhelmed by the chaos. He then looked back at Genevieve. "A true king does not need a queen to provide him with strength, Lady Sinclair," Silas said, his voice echoing with finality. "He needs a queen to remind him what he is fighting for. Elara's spirit survived the worst of your cruelty. She has more strength in her broken bones than you have in your entire lineage." With that, King Silas stepped out into the freezing winter air, carrying his mate toward the royal carriages. The Blackwood pack, once a symbol of northern arrogance, burned behind them, not with fire, but with the cold, absolute justice of the Alpha King. The journey to the Obsidian Citadel, the towering fortress capital of the unified territories, took 3 days. For Elara, it felt like an extended, feverish dream. She was housed in the king's personal carriage, surrounded by velvet cushions and heated bricks. Silas never left her side. He fed her warm broth with his own hands, speaking to her in low, soothing tones that slowly coaxed her traumatized wolf out of its terrified silence. When they arrived at the citadel, the real work began. Silas summoned Dr. Harrison Caldwell, the most prestigious healer in the realm. Dr. Caldwell was a grizzled, no-nonsense elder wolf who took one look at Elara's leg and cursed loudly, uncaring of the king's presence. "The bone was deliberately set wrong, sire," Dr. Caldwell explained, examining the jagged protrusion beneath Elara's skin. "It's a cruel trick used by rogue factions to permanently hobble prisoners. To fix it, to let her walk without pain, I have to re-break it. It will require surgical precision and immense pain." Elara panicked, her breath hitching as she tried to pull her leg away. The trauma of the initial beating flashed before her eyes. "No, please," she begged, her voice hoarse. "I'm used to it. Leave it. Please." Silas sat on the edge of the large canopy bed. He gently cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears that spilled over her eyelashes. He had ordered her bathed and dressed in soft silk, but to him she was just as beautiful now as she was covered in soot. "Elara, look at me," Silas whispered. "I swear on my life, you will never face pain alone again. I will take it from you." Through the mate bond, an alpha could absorb the physical suffering of their counterpart, but it was incredibly draining, even for a warlord. Still, Elara trusted the sincerity in his glowing amber eyes. She nodded. As Dr. Caldwell applied the pressure to re-snap the bone, Elara screamed, but Silas violently gripped her hand. Suddenly, the blinding agony vanished from Elara's leg, transferring entirely into Silas. The king gritted his teeth, the veins in his neck bulging, sweat pouring down his face. But he didn't make a sound. He just held her, bearing the sins of her abusers so she could heal. Over the next 2 months, Elara transformed. With proper nutrition, safety, and the constant, thrumming presence of her mate, Elara's physical scars faded. Her limp disappeared completely. But the most shocking change was her scent and her wolf. The ash and bitter root had washed away, revealing a scent so potent and pure, wild honey, rain, and blooming night jasmine, that guards had to be stationed at the end of her hallway, because unmated wolves were driven into a frenzy by it. Furthermore, her wolf was not a standard, submissive Omega. As Elara healed, she began to experience vivid visions of pack movements, weather changes, and political unrest before they happened. Dr. Caldwell dug deep into the royal archives and discovered the truth. The Hughes bloodline carried the dormant gene of the Lunar Seers, an ancient class of Omegas whose intuition and spiritual power were meant to guide the raw aggression of warlord alphas. Elara wasn't a broken toy. She was a national treasure. However, not everyone in the capital accepted this miraculous transformation. The old guard, deeply entrenched in prejudice, viewed Elara as a threat. Chief among them was Alpha Conrad Sterling, Silas's uncle and the ruler of the Eastern Vanguard. Conrad was a massive, brutal traditionalist who believed Silas's obsession with the Ash Queen was making the crown weak. The tension boiled over during the Winter Solstice Gala, Elara's first official presentation to the High Court. The grand ballroom of the Citadel was a sea of glittering jewels, silk, and military uniforms. Elara stood beside Silas on the dais, wearing a breathtaking gown of midnight blue velvet embroidered with silver thread, her dark hair cascading down her back. She looked every inch a queen, but the room was heavy with silent judgment. Conrad Stirling stepped forward, refusing to bow. He slammed his fist against his chest. "King Silas!" Conrad's voice boomed, silencing the musicians. "The Eastern Vanguard refuses to acknowledge this mating. You have dragged a crippled servant into the throne room and dressed her in stolen jewels. Our enemies in the south are massing, and you give us a frail Omega to lead our armies? It is a disgrace to the Stirling bloodline. I invoke the right of challenge." Gasps echoed through the hall. The right of challenge was ancient. It meant Conrad was challenging Silas for the crown itself, citing the king's incompetence. Silas's eyes immediately flared gold, his fangs descending. He stepped in front of Ilara, his muscles coiling for a lethal strike. "You overstep, uncle. I will mount your head on the citadel gates for speaking to your queen that way." "Let him prove her worth," Conrad sneered, beginning to shift. His bones cracked and reformed, his clothes tearing as a massive, scarred grey wolf took his place on the marble floor. The grey wolf snarled, saliva dripping from its jaws, radiating a terrifying killing intent. Silas prepared to shift, ready to slaughter his uncle, but a gentle hand touched his shoulder. Ilara stepped out from behind him. She didn't look afraid. In fact, her eyes, usually a soft hazel, were glowing a brilliant, luminescent silver. "Let me," her wolf whispered to Silas through the bond. Silas hesitated, but the overwhelming calm radiating from her forced him to step back. Ilara walked down the marble steps of the dais, approaching the massive, snarling grey wolf. Conrad snapped his jaws, lunging forward to intimidate her, fully expecting her to cower, cry, or faint. Instead, Ilara closed her eyes and let her beast free. She didn't shift in a violent spray of blood and tearing fabric like male alphas did. It was a fluid, breathtaking explosion of pure, ethereal light. When the light faded, standing in the center of the ballroom was not a frail Omega, but a magnificent, towering white wolf. Her fur shimmered like fresh snow under moonlight, and a visible aura of spiritual pressure radiated from her form. The room dropped by 10 degrees. The sheer, overwhelming purity of the Lunar Seer's aura hit the crowd like a tidal wave. It wasn't the suffocating, violent dominance of an alpha. It was an absolute, paralyzing command of the soul. Conrad's grey wolf froze mid-snarl. The aggressive energy was violently stripped from his body. Ilara's white wolf took one slow, deliberate step forward, her silver eyes locking on to Conrad. The spiritual weight of her gaze carried the judgment of the moon goddess herself. Conrad whimpered. The massive, battle-hardened alpha tried to stand his ground, but his legs trembled. Slowly, agonizingly, the pressure forced his front paws to slide forward until his chest hit the marble floor. Conrad Stirling, the ruler of the East, flattened his ears and bared his throat to the Ash Queen in total, unforced submission. The entire ballroom followed suit. One by one, every alpha, beta, and noble dropped to their knees, bowing their heads. Ilara shifted back, standing tall and unbroken in her midnight gown. She looked back at Silas, offering him a soft, radiant smile. Silas walked down the steps, his chest swelling with an unimaginable pride, and took her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. They had tried to break her, to bury her in the dark, but they had only succeeded in forging a queen whose light would guide the kingdom for a millennium. Did Ilara's incredible journey from a shattered Omega in the root cellar to the magnificent Lunar Queen leave you absolutely breathless? Sometimes the strongest power comes from the ones society tries to break the hardest. If you loved this epic tale of fated mates, royal betrayal, and sweet revenge, please hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling werewolf romance dramas.